Short answer, yes. Yes, Dynasty Warriors 9 is a bad game. Long answer, still yes. Dynasty Warriors 9 is a bad game, but it's nowhere near a giant hot mess of unplayable garbage like a lot of people and their model would like you to believe, and I am making this video to tell you why I think so. Let's get this out of the way first. There are a lot of bad things about the game, and tons of people have already discussed to death all those bad things these last 3 years, but I still need to list this out because there is literally no way to avoid them if I want to talk about the game. First, the most obvious thing is how the game is now open world instead of stage-based like the old games. This leads to most of the problems that present in the game. In fact, I would argue that most of the game's problems can be traced back to it being an open world game. In older games, the non-combat periods where you move from point A to point B don't take much time at all, only a few seconds or at worst little more than a minute, and during these periods, other characters more often than not will have dialogue just to progress the story and giving out objectives for the player to accomplish, thus filling the dead air while the character is moving. But in Dynasty Warriors 9, it being open world means that it now takes a whole lot more time to move around if you don't use fast travel, which is made a lot worse because the environment is just ugly as hell with wide open empty plains painted mostly in the brown color of Turks. The ugly environment is very hard to not notice because there's barely any dialogue just going on or any noticeable landmarks to distract you. And when there is something popping up on screen, it's usually this. The game has some seriously bad issue of frame rate drop, and I blame this on the game not being able to effectively render the open world. It has thankfully been somewhat remedied with all the updates, but the issue is not gone yet even when you're playing the game with the action mode that stabilizes the frame rate. One more thing that I can't help but criticize is that the open world effectively kills off stage designs. The stage designs is still there like with Yuan Shao's camp at Guandu that slowly leads you to where Yuan Shao's resigns, or the stone sentinel maze during the Battle of Yili with its maze-like cave paths, or the new heavy castle with its massive walls and traps. But 98% of the time, the whole game is just a bunch of ugly access copy-pasted onto big empty plains or crammed tiny little castles. One of the game's few good points that is its OST also got given hard by the open world nature, because most of the time you will either hear nothing because you're moving from point A to point B, or you're hearing yet another standard battle theme being played because you're engaging in the Jerick skirmish number 75921, and this specific theme of certain famous battles are only played when you approach the main objective of the battle, which not only make up a very beautifully little part of the game, but also can be cleared in little to no time at all, making it very hard to absorb in the music and the atmosphere the music was trying to create. And in some cases, the music is also very misused, as seen in the case of this battle of Jerby, where the epic music is playing while the player character is calmly waiting for the Wei forces to reach the shore of the Wu forces. And then there's the loading screen. The fucking loading screen, man. Booting up the game, loading screen. Fast travel, loading screen. Finished an objective and a cutscene is about to begin, loading screen. A cutscene just finished, yet another loading screen. You die, loading screen again. And Anyway, everyone and their mother has already patched the game to death these past 3 years, so I don't think I need to talk more about those bad things, or otherwise this video would be 6 times as long and would be totally irrelevant to the things that I actually want to talk about, which are... The first and the best good thing about the game is its combat overhaul. Gone are the old combats with its simple mix of normal and charge attacks, and in its place is a whole new system comprised of flow attacks, reactive attacks, trigger attacks, and special attacks. To those new to Dynasty Warriors 9, all these fancy words and the way the new combat system plays out may seem confusing, but it's actually really simple after a bit of getting used to. Flow attacks is basically just the normal attack, but instead of just one normal attack string, the character now has several attack strings depending on the enemy state. There's the flow attack string for when the enemy is standing normally. There's the flow attack string for when the enemy is in the air. There's the flow attack string for when the enemy is stunned. There's the flow attack string for when the enemy is knocked down. And to complement these new attack strings that depend on the enemy stakes, we have the trigger attacks. These trigger attacks can be executed by pressing the R1 button combined with either square, triangle, or X. R1 plus square is the attack to temporarily stun the enemy. R1 plus triangle is the attack to launch the enemy into the air. R1 plus X is the attack to knock the enemy down. These attacks are interchangeable with each other, and the character can cancel the attacks by either jumping or rolling out of the way at any given time. Then we have reaction attacks, which is just a press triangle to do stuff, ranging from immediately dashing towards the enemy from far away, parrying their attacks, or finishing off the enemy officer that has little health left. All these new types of attack can be seamlessly changed to each other, meaning that you have total freedom in approaching the combat, executing and cancelling any attack, and keep the combat endlessly going without a single movement of break, the thing that the rainbow system of Dynasty Warriors 6 once tried to set out to do, but with varying degree of failure. This is a breath of fresh air that the franchise desperately needed to break out of their old formula, and involves more than just press square a couple of times, then press triangle to do the stuff that you want. If there's anything that I could complain about this new combat system, it would be that the new moveset is still rather primitive and stationary. Every character starts out with their full moveset and doesn't unlock anything new throughout the game, and half of the flow attack strings are just the character staying in place to do some quick hack and slash, making the combat quickly falls into a repetitive rhythm. But with that said, this new combat system laid out a very solid foundation for future games to build upon. If the devs can declone the characters, find a way to implement weapon switching on the fly, and expand the basic flow attack strings, or maybe create more variants to the trigger attacks, like depends on the enemy stakes, not just the flow attacks, the trigger attacks will also have different attacks, then the combat system would be greatly improved and potentially reaches the level of complexity of Sengoku Basara games. One more good point about the new combat system is how weapons and its elements play out. When you first starting out, the way the character fights can be a bit blank because the moves don't have any visible special effects going on, and a lot of the weapons can feel really sluggish too. But after playing for a while, you can pick up gems after defeating enemy officers, and these gems offer a lot of options to enhance the combat, from adding visible special element effects like fire, ice, or lightning to the trigger attacks and then change into the flow attacks, to increasing the weapon's attack or attack speed as long as you can keep the weapon's elements taking effect by keeping up your assaults on the enemy. Further incentivize the player to mix and match the attacks and not giving the enemy a chance to even breathe. This new gem system offers a lot more flexible options to approach combat compared to the old forging system where you only have like 8 element slots to upgrade your weapon, and you can forge a total of 6 gems onto every weapon. Though the new gem system is not perfect, as what gems you get and its effects are totally randomized, and there is really no way for the player to affect this aside from playing on higher difficulties to have a better chance at gaining gems with higher quality. If the devs can mix this gem system with something like Neo's forging system, where the equipment and its special effects are still randomized, but the player has the option to visit the blacksmith and report the effects into something else, then that would be perfect in my opinion. That would be it for the more visible good points in my opinion. Going somewhat unnoticeable to most is the way the game approaches objectives and how a battle plays out. I mentioned earlier that the open world effectively killed off stage design for this game, but to somewhat make up for it, the player is now totally free to decide on how to approach a battle, whether to do an optional objective first or go straight for the enemy commander of the battle, and depends on the objective the player has done, new objectives can be unlocked or other objectives can be affected and have different outcomes when the player finally approaches said other objectives. This aspect is honestly really underplayed because most of the time the objectives aren't very well connected to each other, the open world messing up the pacing between objectives and battles, and there are barely any noticeable dialogues going on between objectives. Once again, I blame this on the open world aspect. I think this is a very unfortunate misstep because I honestly prefer this approach a lot more than the hallway stage designs of modern Musou games where the stage just outright gets you away from proceeding and forces you to do certain objectives first, making for a really linear and quick to repetitive gameplay after multiple replays. Then there's the siege battles. Yes, you are still a god mowing down thousands of men without breaking a sweat, but for the first time since Dynasty Warriors 6 way back in 2007, you now have to rely on your allies to build siege weapons like rams and siege tower, and you have to fight together with your allies in order to advance and take over a castle, which helps the game regaining back a little bit of the feeling of being a warrior in the middle of an actual battlefield, an aspect that has been unfortunately lost somewhere during the franchise evolution in the past decade. Yes, I know there's this thing called the grappling hook that completely renders this point moot, but I still stand by the point that the game did try, okay? Then here comes my favorite thing about the game, the photo mode. With the total of 90 playable characters, 36 types of weapons, the ability to freely adjust the facial expressions of the characters right down to the direction they are looking at, the time of the day, the weather, the dirt and the sweat on the characters, as well as how wet the characters are, and tons of stamps and camera effects. This photo mode was honestly the most in-depth photo mode I've seen in a game until Ghost of Tsushima comes out. This in-depth photo mode combines with tons of available character animations as well as a lot of different environments and situations the character can be in, make it a lot of joy to mess around with. This photo mode initially wasn't in the game and was only added through updates, and it's honestly not something that I think is a must-have in a Musou game, but it's honestly the most fun I have with the game, and I would be sorely upset if the next game doesn't have photo mode in it. And the last thing that I would add into this short list of good things about Dynasty Warriors 9 is how the devs didn't immediately abandon the game. The game had a very rough launch that was plagued with issues like atrocious frame rate, which is still an issue to this day mind you, or annoying cut-ins that break the base of the combat. Heck, the game didn't even have co-op play at first. Questionable DLC practices aside, the devs kept churning out update patches to somewhat fix the game well into its life cycle, and I compliment them for that. Does that make Dynasty Warriors 9 a good game though? Hell no!